Let's take
Oh,
perfect.
Sorry, my multiple Zoom accounts and I couldn't log in because I had to log in before I joined. Everyone's doing a great job. Okay, cool.
Thanks, Nick. All right, let's jump into it. And if you guys want to take a second and scan this QR code over here or go to menti.com, and I'm gonna open this a little more. There you go. So we'll have a couple of Menti moments here. I like that word, Menti moments, where we'll jump in, we'll get feedback, and we'll have a quick discussion. So like I said, today agenda is what is acceptance testing. Then we will jump into how we think about automated acceptance testing and how that kind of ties into XP. Like I said, Dale is the expert here, so I'm going to only spend a few minutes talking about this, and then we'll jump into user acceptance testing and how we can think about that. And then lastly, follow up with design reviews. And then I will pass it over to Anderson, who's going to show this group how the harm team is approaching doing their acceptance testing from a functional perspective. All right, so to start us off, this is really open-ended. I want to get the group kind of thinking about how you think about testing. So if you all could scan the QR code and go in and just write down pretty open-ended what words come to mind when you think of the word testing. So I'm going to switch my screen share here really quick, and let's just get our brains warmed up today. Breaking things, trial and error, integration, jest, unit, TDD, quasi-proof. I don't know what that is. What's quasi-proof? Whoever wrote that.
that was me. It's like it's a proof, but it's not like a mathematical proof. So it's kind
Okay,
of it's almost a proof, but not quite.
awesome. Security, confirmation. We have a couple people talking about confirmation. Can somebody who wrote confirmation chime in and explain a little bit what you were thinking when writing that word down?
I think it was just like, hey, you're confirming that everything, all the work that you did actually meets the need or produces the outcome that you were trying to produce.
Yeah. CYA. Oh, that's funny. Thanks, Clayton. I'm just reading through some of these new ones that come in. But yeah, I totally agree with what you said there. Just confirmation that things are working, that what we originally intended for the story is actually following through. What else do we have here? Design activity, finish line. Who wrote down finish line?
That was me too.
Okay. Thanks, Clayton. I thought that one was interesting too, because it it technically can be considered a finish line. I would argue that, like, is there ever necessarily a finish line because requirements are evolving, but for an individual story, 100%, that can definitely be a finish line. Cool. I like a lot of these. Edge case is interesting. Does it work? We'll touch on, honestly, like most of these words today. So stay tuned. I like the CYA one because obviously you want to have some form of testing to make sure that, like, whatever you put into production isn't going to break on you and all of a sudden you're in trouble. So testing is a good way to cover yourself, cover your team, and make sure that things are functioning the way that they intended. All right, I'm going to jump back to our lecture here really quickly, and we will start talking about it. So what is acceptance testing? You guys touched on a lot of it, which is great. Acceptance testing can be considered many things. So from a general perspective, when we think of acceptance testing in software development, it refers to any process in which we are testing a new system, a new feature, functionality against the acceptance criteria that we've identified in the story. So this all starts with acceptance criteria. So given the user is doing something, when they take some type of action, then this is the result. So that's basically checking to make sure that this new functionality is working. So it essentially evaluates whether or not the product has met these requirements. And it makes sure that this feature is functional. The result of an acceptance test can only be two things. What are those two things? What could the result of a test be?
Pass or
fail.
Yes, thank you. So those are our two options: pass, fail. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Ian. So often these are automated, but they don't always, that doesn't always happen. So they could be automated acceptance tests or manual, and we'll talk about both of those today. So why is this important? They're basically making sure that we're meeting the requirements, but also almost more importantly, it involves the engineers. The engineers are involved in the acceptance testing process. So this helps foster empathy because they're actually like writing code, thinking of the users in their mind. So we're also minimizing the possibility of defects because we're writing our test directly against the acceptance criteria. So when we write out those stories, the engineers take those stories in that given when and then statement, and then they basically build their tests and build their code based off of that acceptance criteria. So where do these origins come from? Actually, XP, which is great. So XP, we all know what it is. And the thought of acceptance testing, the idea of it started in 1996. They were identified as a practice of XP without too much emphasis on unit or acceptance testing. So there wasn't like a huge distinction between like a unit test versus an acceptance test at first. There's no particular tool recommended. But then in 2002, Ward Cunningham, one of the inventors of XP, basically built this published FIT, which was a tool for acceptance testing. And then from there, it kind of like iterated on until we eventually get to like the common mainstream model for agile acceptance testing. So when we think about this, we have our release planning, we have our iteration, and then when we're doing this type of coding, from the user stories to the acceptance test, that's really where this is all happening. During the iteration, we're taking our user stories, we're writing the test scenarios, and then basically coding acceptance tests. And then that gets moved over to release. So when we think about it, acceptance testing actually has its origins with XP, and then that evolved into agile acceptance testing. Now, when we think of this on a tiered level, this is where it really gets interesting, in my opinion. So we think about acceptance testing, but then what about all these other types of tests? So if we start at the bottom, unit testing is basically like, is this function returning the correct value? Then we move up to integration, where it's like, is everything talking to each other? Is everything happy? Are the API and the database talking well to each other? If we have web services, like, are those working properly, or is something broken? Then we move up to system testing, which is, are all the features working together as expected in the system? And then at the highest level is really where we put the user. So this is the acceptance testing, where is my application providing valuable functionality to the end users? And so that's really where we get into the idea that acceptance tests are focused on validating business goals and like user functionality. So it basically goes from like the lowest level, most granular unit tests all the way up to the highest level user-focused acceptance tests. Now, like I mentioned before, there are two ways to execute acceptance tests. The first being automated. So automated acceptance tests need to be, automated acceptance tests are effective XP tools. So basically, when we think of automated acceptance tests, that means that they're coded in. So automated means the code is doing something to actually run this test and it's passing, and therefore the user functionality is working. So this becomes like a stress reliever for our engineers versus manual acceptance tests. With manual testing, we're basically like backloading all of our tests. So we've already coded everything, and then manually somebody's going in, pulling up the application, looking at the acceptance criteria. They have like two tabs open, and they're making sure that like the linear and the acceptance criteria is matching what's happening in the system. So it's not automated, it's not in the code, but someone is going in and someone is running a test manually. So they don't provide that consistent, instantaneous feedback that like engineers and developers crave. Like a lot of times we push it to the end and they're like, "Ooh, I don't know if this works. I think it does because I ran it on my local machine, but TBD." And then you find out later that something broke. So obviously there's going to be some emphasis toward automated testing. However, we don't just want to totally punt it and say like we never want to do manual testing. That's not the case. I will argue though that like if the better and more consistent the automated tests, the less defects we're going to find down the road. So like I said before, the trade-off here is cost. So with automation, we have a higher upfront cost because this requires more of our engineers' times. We pay engineers more than we pay any other function. I'm just kidding. I mean, maybe we probably do, but we front load the cost here, and that cost is amortized quickly because we get into the rhythm of it. We're writing really good stories, Acceptance tests are run nightly or more frequently when we have those automated test suites run up. So we always just want to put an emphasis on more testing up front, because then that effect trickles down. And moving on towards the benefits of acceptance testing, the first being it increases the satisfaction of your customer or your user, because we know that the requirements are met. So when we have this focus on our user and we're directly coding what our user requirements are, which we'll see here in a second, an example, that 100% means that we're coding something that we know is valuable, because we're incorporating that into our discovery process, our framing process, and our release process. We're really just closing the circle there. The next being that we identify functionality and usability issues early on. That basically is a stopgap for the engineers before they pass it on to any product manager or any designer. So that's like the earliest possible point where we'll discover an issue. And we are, if we're doing automated acceptance testing. We're promoting collaboration and empathy between developers and the end user, because the developers are directly looking at like the given when and thens. They're understanding what is trying to be accomplished by the user and what that value is. And then they're putting that directly into the code. When we test earlier, we find fewer big defects right before deployment. Like I said, it's almost like a sieve or like a filter, where we're finding these and identifying them up front before letting them like leak through down to the production environment. It's incorporating everyone in the process, so less big defects will get through to the user. And then on that similar note, decrease the severity and chance of new defects and regressions, because this is all part of our new or our effective development process. So on that note, where does acceptance testing fit into our process? And that's going to be two places. So where does it fit for the first part, early and often? We've already talked about this. This is automated acceptance tests coded as part of the iteration process for every individual story. So this is going to be the first place where we actually like write these automated acceptance tests. However, like I said before, we don't want to totally punt the idea of manual acceptance tests. So manual acceptance tests are going to happen before we promote the code to production. So like I said, we want to put emphasis on number one, but we're not going to totally ignore the fact that we need to do manual acceptance testing. In the next section of this talk, we'll actually discuss kind of like the difference between, you know, what a PM does versus what we should have our users doing for acceptance testing. Another way to look at this is part of our agile process. So if we start here with the define and design part of our story, we're writing our stories, we're prioritizing and estimating them. The first thing we do when we start working on it is we build this test. So this is the automated acceptance test that you're writing based off of your AC. You're finishing it, you deliver it to maybe a PM, and there's some manual acceptance testing that's happening here. But up here, before we release, we're definitely doing some type of manual acceptance testing. So this could be done by our product manager, by our users, but it always happens before we release. Okay. And then when we think about this first part, so like, okay, what happens then exactly when we're thinking about this automated acceptance test? And Dale's going to get into this a lot more. This is just a little teaser for the codifying acceptance criteria workshop and lecture that he's going to run next as a follow-up to this. But basically, we're thinking about how we take our acceptance criteria layer and then build a test implementation layer. So if we look at this graphic here on the right, we're starting with our TDD process, where we take the acceptance criteria, we write a failing test, then we code it to make that failing test pass. And then if there's any refactoring that we need to do, then that can come in, and we want to make sure everything plays nicely with each other so that nothing else fails. But the first step is taking this acceptance criteria and then building a test layer to make sure that the functionality is actually working. Are there any questions? I'm going to pause really quickly before I jump into an example. Anybody have questions so far or comments for what we've talked about up to this point? Awesome. All right, we're moving on. Let's take a look at a very, very high level example, because like I said, not a developer here, not an engineer, but hopefully this is something that everybody can understand. So first we have this acceptance criteria layer. What does this look like for initially? Anybody can come off mute. What does this look like? not a trick question, I promise.
It looks like a user story.
Exactly. Thanks, Dan. So this is what you'd find in linear. It's, hey, it's a given, it's a when, it's a then. So we have our feature, we have our scenario, and our given, when, and then statement. Now, what we do from there is we take this lovely test implementation layer, and that's really where the engineers have this creative freedom to write a failing test and then write some code to match the AC and start passing the tests as well. So there are different tools that you can, and frameworks that you can use along the way, but from a high level perspective, this is what happens when we're building an automated acceptance test. There are some best practices to follow when we're writing automated acceptance tests. And I'm sure there's 100%, 1,000 more pro tips that you're going to get from Dale moving forward. But here are just some high level things that everybody should potentially understand when thinking about these best practices. Yep. Ian?
Question about the last slide.
Yeah.
So BDD libraries like Cucumber, Ginkgo, BHAP, Behavior, Lettuce. What is a BDD?
Yeah, so BDD is really similar to TDD. It's just it's basically like a similar flavor where we call it behavioral driven development testing instead of like test driven development. So they can be pretty much be used interchangeably.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, so when we think about best practices, the first is that tests should be written in advance of implementation. We want to think about how we're structuring our tests before we actually code them, which is easier said than done. A lot of times in normal development and waterfall development, we write the functionality we want to accomplish, and then we think about testing as a secondary method to find the user story. This really flips it over. It's like we want to think about our tests first so that we can make sure that everything is going to pass successfully. We probably want to avoid production data, essentially because we don't want to like test in production. We want to make sure that we're testing a smaller sample of data that reflect production, but not necessarily production data in our testing environment specifically. And that kind of goes with the second one. We never want to run these like automated acceptance tests that we're building in a real life production system because we don't want to break anything in production. We want to try to mock up data and mock up services as much as possible. We want to keep them loose. So we actually don't want to like be too stringent with our tests because coupling it too tightly can lead to false positives and extra maintenance work down the road. So we want to leave some flexibility to have it work with future functionality as well. And then lastly, don't break code encapsulations. We want to test using the same public functions or APIs offered by the code. So we don't want to do any like privileged backdoors to run a specific test. We want, like I said before, this kind of goes back to like production environments, production data. Like we want to mimic real life scenarios as much as possible. So avoid adding like workarounds when we're building our tests. All right, we're going to move back to Mentimeter because we've talked a lot about acceptance testing and we've talked a lot about like best practices and how things should work. And what I want to know and get your perspective on is what might make this all difficult. And there's no right or wrong answer here. We talk about everything like as it's this perfect system where we know all the acceptance criteria and it's laid out perfectly. So what, from your opinion, might make it difficult? I'm going to switch the slide here so you can all submit an answer to build automated acceptance tests. I will switch over my screen share as these answers come through. Time crunch, unclear AC, vague acceptance criteria. Yep, those are all really good responses. Just remembering that I have to I'm going to look for 2 or 3 more responses and then we'll discuss. Troubleshooting testing code if AC is not specific enough. Acumen, some things aren't always able to be tested. Awesome. Can I have somebody who submitted one of these answers speak up and just explain what their thought process was when they submitted it?
I can't. No one else wants to go. I'd rather someone else go though.
I'll go.
Oh, send it.
Thanks, Cody.
Okay. I put time crunch. I mean, it's just writing tests take up a long time, and we do it because it's good practice, but I can imagine a scenario where it's like there's not enough time. We have to get something out on a certain deadline, and we just make that sacrifice.
Yeah, I completely understand that. I think we've seen that a lot with Swarm too, just because we had that potential deadline that we were all working towards. And then we saw after we kind of extended the timeline, we realized the body of work to do that, like, hey, we need to go back and add tests in. So I think that like sometimes when we code, one of the first things that happens is that we or when we're on a time crunch, one of the first things that goes is tests. And as long as you have to have some type of balance, like as long as we know that like, hey, we're going to skip this and come back to it later and document that, which I think the team did a really good job of coming back after and saying like, we need to build tests back in. I do think that, there's a balance and you can't get 100% perfect test coverage all the time. But yes, time crunch definitely can impact the ability to build automated acceptance tests and good acceptance tests. Dale, you want to share?
Sure. I was just speaking up because no one else was, but I
We
put
always like to hear your thoughts.
acumen simply because I think acceptance tests in particular are, if you get acceptance test right, this is the hallmark of a mature team, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you typically don't start out doing acceptance testing. That's something you grow into. And the reason I put acumen is because it's really hard to have your project managers need to be technical enough to be able to write a good acceptance test, where they're using Cucumber or whatever they're using, right? They need to be technical enough to do that. And then your engineers need to understand how to hook in and make steps and everything to hook into that. And you have to understand your system well enough to be able to do this beforehand. So there's a lot of things that's got to be worked out. Like you've got to know what your UI looks like. You got to know where things are on the screen and some stuff like that, right? So that was my only thought. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. That actually brings up an interesting anecdote. So back when I was working for like a large bank, we had never followed like test-driven development. It was always like normal AC, but then like the engineers had their freedom to basically like build the code as they saw fit. Like they didn't have to tie it directly. We then made a shift at some point to, hey, we're actually gonna follow test-driven development. And all of our analysts, which are essentially like the people that were functioning as product managers, they were basically like writing the acceptance criteria. They freaked out because they're like, this is going to be so much work on our side because now we have to write really, really detailed acceptance criteria. And when we started implementing it, the entire project completely slowed down. Like we probably moved a quarter as fast as we were before because we were now making really detailed AC. So like I think that's an interesting note because like we said before, like we don't want to, if I go back to this other slide, like we don't want to have it be coupled too tightly because that's basically what caused our slowdown and we were never able to speed back up again. Eventually I checked back in, I moved off that project and I checked back in later on and they had actually just moved away from it because they realized they were moving too slowly. So you want to build in like some type of flexibility and make sure it works for your team, but also ensuring that like you're getting the right amount of AC. So like to perfect it, as Dale said, it's definitely more of an art than a science. You have to have like really well-skilled engineers, really good acceptance criteria being written by the PM or whoever's writing those stories. So it's definitely can be very difficult. Any other thoughts here on this Mentimeter slide? I think all of these are definitely valid difficulties that need to be addressed and worked around in order for automated acceptance tests to run effectively. All right. So more to come on automated acceptance tests. And I'm going to pass that torch over to Dale for the next session. But for now, we're going to move on to the more functional manual style of testing, which can be considered user acceptance testing. So there are kind of, like I said, two flavors here. There's the acceptance testing that the PM will do, which typically happens when a story gets moved over to whatever your step is before done. And then there's the flavor of like, hey, we want to, we have this package ready for release. We want to make sure that our users get their hands on it so we're not missing anything. And we've interpreted their asks and their pain points correctly. And that's what we call UAT, or user acceptance testing. So when do we run manual user acceptance tests? So first, it just basically means whether the product is working effectively for the user. So these are typically called end user testing, and we want to do this before we release. So anytime before we release, we will ideally get our users' hands on it. Now, there's a difference if you're releasing every single week versus like once a month. Once a month, you probably want to incorporate like a formal user acceptance testing process to get your users testing your product. If you're doing it every week and there's smaller functionality, then there's more flexibility to say like, hey, this is more minor. We know it works. Our users don't need to get their hands on it. So it's important because this is the essential validation process of the software against like the business requirements, the user requirements, and this validation is carried out by your users. So this is really important because we're going to find out really interesting things here, whether or not like they're happy with what's happening, if they have more suggestions for how they think the product would work better. This is one of the best places to help build your roadmap. So like we have this formal upfront research process, which is probably the number one way we'll build our roadmap, by just doing that initial user research. But anytime we have formal testing done with our users and their hands are on the keyboard and we're observing them, it's a great time to get more insights for how you can improve your product. So in this process, if we kind of formalize this, we have our requirements and we make our designs, and then we start developing them. Ideally, this is more of a circle than a bunch of arrows going one way. But really what I want us to focus on is this right side of the process, where we're developing and we're building our automated testing as part of development. And then once that's done, we're doing our user acceptance testing. So the story is ready for release. We want our users to actually test it and then collect feedback, and then kind of incorporate that into our development process. So this is typically the final step before we release into production. And this happens after automated acceptance testing. Now, like I said before, there might be two steps here. So this user acceptance testing, like this could be product manager acceptance testing. We're doing that a lot now since we're kind of building our path to production. We're not ready to release in production yet. So our PM will test this for now, move it to done. And then once we're ready to release that initial MVP and get into this cadence of pushing into production, we'll incorporate this user acceptance testing, so getting our users to actually do the testing for us, into our process. So there's some hot takes from XP on user acceptance testing and doing this manually. So XP from their perspective doesn't really believe in a ton of like user acceptance testing or manual acceptance testing. Basically, they say if the programmer's tests are perfect, the customer test won't catch any errors. So if we do our jobs, that shouldn't need to happen. I hate the word perfect though, because we don't work in a perfect world. So ideally we need this step to basically like make sure that everything's working together, and together collectively, all of our requirements are kind of making one usable, valuable product. Another comment, beta testing is a symptom of weak testing practices and poor communication with customers. So that's another kind of hot take that I pulled from the XP book. So basically they're saying that like, hey, we shouldn't actually need this if we've done our research up front, if we've communicated well with them and made sure that's translated into our AC. However, like I said, we don't have perfect communication with our users, which isn't a fault of anybody. Our users are busy and we only get them for, once every week or once every 2 weeks. So it's not going to be a perfect world. And the last comment here is the team's goal is to eliminate all post-development testing and shift testing resources to a more highly leveraged parts of the development lifecycle. So I do agree with this. The more that we can excel at testing upfront in the process, the fewer defects we're going to see down low in the further parts of the process that will impact our normal development cycle. So I do mostly agree with that, but definitely some hot takes. And I think generally they're agreeable on the fact that like, hey, we want to focus on good research, good requirements, and good tests. And if we do that, then UAT should be a breeze. So I do agree with that as well. The benefits, like I said, so having our user do acceptance testing validates decisions made by your engineering and your design team. So they validate the decisions that the engineers have made when writing the code, the design teams when they've written the designs, arguably the product manager too when they've written the story. They help collect information from outside of your organization to understand what works and what doesn't. So basically, as the builders who are accustomed to using their app and their features, your developers are going to have more experiences and knowledge than a general user exposed to that for the first time. So UAT basically helps take a step back and understand, has something been overlooked or missed? Because like we're so in the weeds every day with our product, we kind of need to take a higher level look at our application. And lastly, UAT can guide you towards solving issues around scale and scope. So if we're going through UAT process and we discover that like this feature is just wildly popular, like everybody's using it, or maybe they're using it so much that it's taxing our database or our API or our resources, we might allocate more resources towards there, like servers or disk space, to ensure that it operates properly when we release it to an even wider audience. So there's some almost like functional aspect of like scalability and performance there that we can catch when we have our users test our product. So as like a closing comment here, there's an enormous risk for business that don't run a UAT process. So UAT take about 10% of an overall project timeline. I don't like the word project, but if we're just laying out the idea of a timeline here, like 10% of this process might be dedicated towards UAT, but it can save about 30% more time in the future by identifying some errors ahead of time and ahead of a release. So the time savings definitely net out positive with UAT. However, like I said, maybe this is not 30%, but only 15% if we have that really good testing process up front. So how do we do this? There's about 5 steps here. So the first is you want to identify who your audience is. Who is the user that we want to select to actually run our tests in our UAT environment before we push to production? And this might be in a UAT or a staging. It really just depends on your actual environment setup. So the development team should not participate in this test because, like I said, we want to take a higher level step. And I would argue that like you probably want like 1 or 2 power users, but you really do want average users as well. We don't want to like, our power users are going to know all the workarounds. They're going to know the product really well. Having an average user perform UATs, I find to be a lot more helpful and realistic than having our power user do it. So if we could get 2 to 3 users, maybe one's a power user and one's like a more average user, that would be the ideal process. You want to build a test plan. And I'll show an example here in a few slides of what that could look like. It's basically going to include some type of objective. So what are we actually trying to accomplish with our tests? The scope. So it's going to lay out kind of like all the requirements you want your user to test, and the schedule. So, hey, when do we need this done by? And then usually the PM, or it could really be anybody on the balance team, can create those test cases. So what should be tested and some type of tool to track this. And then we're going to create a UAT environment and some data. So we want to make sure that data reflects production, but isn't necessarily like pointing directly to the production environment. And then you'll probably want to either, if you have a good cadence with your users, you might just want to send them all this information and say like, here's how you access our UAT environment. Here's when we need this by. Or you could actually just schedule a live session with them and say, here, we need 60 minutes, we need 90 minutes. I'm going to guide you through this, but like you're sharing your screen. Can you basically run through these tests and I'll fill out whether or not they pass, fail. So that's a good way if your users are really busy to just help them set up for success. So the best practices here are, first, know the users who will ultimately be using the software. We want to set them up to succeed. So we want to choose, if we don't have users, we might want to choose stakeholders who are subject matter experts and make sure that they have time to dedicate to testing. So if somebody is like super busy and they're not going to have time, then they're not going to perform the testing to the ability that we're going to want them to. We want to prepare the UAT plan well in advance. So we all know that we write all of our requirements up front. If we take one extra step and when we build a user story, just add a line to your UAT plan, then you don't have to spend, a couple hours working on it later. So having it in advance will help you. Having a clear structure and order to your UAT plan. So you don't want to like mix like, hey, can you log in right next to like, hey, we need you to submit a form. So like log in, access the dashboard, select create new form. So like it should have some type of logical linear type of flow so that we're not disrupting them. We want to create scenarios based on our user stories and requirements and clearly define the acceptance criteria. So the benefit of user acceptance testing is that we don't have any surprises when we get into production. Now, we all know that in a perfect world, we're going to have our users running our tests for us. But in reality, sometimes our users are super busy. Sometimes there's conflicting time zones and we just can't get them. So if our users aren't available, then who else could potentially perform UAT? So ideally, it's end users. If not, maybe we have potential users that haven't adopted our product yet. Maybe that's for us, like the 607th first form, because they might not be the first people to adopt our product, but they're potential users. So they could be great UAT users for us. You could have stakeholders who are subject matter experts, and then you could have the product manager. I'd probably least recommend the product manager because they're already going to do their own form of acceptance testing. So I would like to stay away from the PM, but ideally if it's not a user, it's some type of subject matter expert or stakeholder that knows the process really well. And that kind of leads us to some challenges with UAT. The first being that like, if we have a stakeholder or a power user testing our product, there's going to be new requirements that come through. And it's up to the product manager and the balance team to kind of put a filter on that and say, like, we're hearing you and we listen to you. Is this 100% necessary for like this release? Is this something that like we can fold into our normal process? So that's where we really need to evaluate whether or not it's going to be a blocker to usage or if it's something that's just a value add that we can put in down the road. Limited time of our key users. So if we don't have 90 minutes for our users to test, we only have 45. What are those 45 minutes of testing going to look like? Like, what's the most important test that we can have our users run? And can our PMs or stakeholders run the edge cases in those tests? Ineffective communication. So if you haven't laid down the UAT plan effectively enough, they might interpret their own type of testing and not understand how to perform it. And that kind of goes to untrained or improper UAT testers. So we want to make sure that we are really explaining to them the value of this and how to do it so that we're not wasting their time. Because if we waste their time, they're not going to be willing to acceptance test for us down the road. Are there any questions here before I jump into an example real quick? And then we'll talk about our third type of test. All right, so here's an example. So it might be a little bit hard to read since there's a lot of information here, but I will walk us through it. So this is a potential UAT plan. I wouldn't necessarily recommend buying a testing software right away. I think UAT plans can run effectively in tools like Excel, or even if we look at Linear, there's probably functionality within Linear that we can find to run a user acceptance test. We have a list of all of our different types of tests here, and then we have our execution status. So has this test failed when we've run through the ability to create a new book or the ability to edit an existing author in this library system? So if we run this and it's passed, then that's great. If it's blocked, this might mean like an upstream acceptance test has failed. So therefore we just can't test this right now. And then there's failed. So we've gone through the acceptance criteria. You're not able to perform that functionality and we need to address this. So there's whoever's owning this test is listed and when it was executed by, whoever created this test. So that's likely the product manager, or if we're getting help from our developers or engineers, that's probably their name. And then the status. So is this ready to test, or do we need to still work through what this test looks like? And then the type. So we're going to have some different types of tests in our plan. We're going to have functional, which is validating the user functionality. Exploratory, so that might be looking at edge cases and just kind of like letting our users explore the application and see what they find. Or it could be a scenario or regression. So it just really depends on what we want to call them. There's also things like system tests and regression tests as well, where we want to test more of the functionality. That's a good question, Michael. I'm actually not sure what this tool is. I'll follow up. It's a good example of like what a normal average testing tool would be, but I'll go back and I'll figure out which test this is. So yeah, basically it should be pretty straightforward. There shouldn't be more than like 7 or 8 columns at most. The most important column here is like what test you're running and whether or not it has passed yet. So we want to make sure that if it's failed, that gets back to our team really quickly and we assess. Now, hot take is that we don't need everything green here to release to production. There might be 1 or 2 failed acceptance tests. It's up to the team to understand whether or not this is a 100% blocker to our production release. So it could be an edge case that we're aware about, but going through UAT, if like they find a workaround really easily, then maybe we leave it failed until our next release. So for most of these, we'll probably end up addressing them if they fail, but if it's something that's really minor in an edge case and there's an easy workaround that we discover, then we might just put it into the backlog for our next release. Are there questions here now that we've seen an actual user acceptance testing plan? Or just about user acceptance testing in general. So like I said, the PM's probably going to get their hands on it and test first. And that's going to be, especially if we like haven't set up our production environment yet, like it's really important that the PM does a really good acceptance test. But the user acceptance testing should happen in some frequency before releasing to production. All right, last section, a third type of test. Can somebody here chime in on like the role that we've kind of touched on least today and what this third type of test might be? Anybody wants to come off mute?
Design.
Thank you, Clayton. Yes. So we've talked a lot about how the product managers acceptance test, they write the acceptance criteria, how they perform some type of acceptance testing that's manual. We've talked about how the engineers are really involved in the process of codifying that acceptance criteria and writing all these tests, but we haven't really talked about design. But design definitely plays a role here in testing. And it might not be formal acceptance testing, but we might just call it something else. But we obviously want our designers to look at what we've built before we put it into production. So it would not be smart of me to finish this lecture without talking about the role that design here plays with testing. So I'm just calling this a design review, but we could call it a design QA, could be a design acceptance test, however we want to call it, but it's the review of the developed UI against the design itself to assess the quality of the product. We want to make sure our design and our developed UI match. And it's a lot easier said than done, as the engineers might know, but there should be some formal process that we're following to make sure that the design that we originally came up with match the developed version. And it's important because this is going to fill the gap between design and execution. So we want the designer to review this implementation so that they have the opportunity to spot gaps that have popped up during this process, because our PMs and our users are not going to know what the original designed version looks like down to like the pixel. PMs probably have a good idea, but they might not know the exact button functionality or something like that. So we want the designer to come in and just be like, hey, has this design been taken and implemented properly? So this will be a chance to turn up errors and log those and have the engineers address them before it gets to the product manager. There are a lot of benefits here because it will encourage collaboration between designers and developers. It'll help identify gaps between the designer and the team before we release. So we'll catch that little stopgap. Sometimes it's embarrassing if we have these big UI bugs that we let our users identify. So this is that stopgap. We maintain a consistent and visual language, combine design thinking with the agile process. So in that circle of, writing our requirements, developing them, testing them, and releasing them, the designers become ingrained in this process, which is always a net positive. There's never a negative or a net negative to involving designers in our development process. So when do we do this? Ideally, this happens before we release, so in this visual, it's called the QA process. Here we'll call it the acceptance testing process. But after development and before it gets to the product manager or to the release. So we want the essentially the designers to get their hands on this when developers have reviewed it and moved it and merged it up, but probably before the PM gets it. However, if the PM and designer want to pair on this together, all the power. So it doesn't need to be like this huge extra manual step. If they want to combine forces and combine acceptance testing with the design review, then that works as well. I like this reference to like having a chef. So a chef is required to try his food before he serves it to the guests in the restaurant. We need to test the product before our users. So this is also just one additional stopgap to help make sure that we're building the right things. And so what gets reviewed during a design QA, this is not exhaustive, but a couple of things. So we want to make sure our fonts are the right size, weight, and color. We want to make sure the interactions are all functioning properly. So things like animations, call to actions, like hovers, active states, disabled states, consistency between the design and the coded version. That's probably the most important, is just overall consistency. Placement of visual elements, so making sure everything's aligned properly and placed in the proper areas. The colors, so making sure that all of the colors match properly. And then lastly, there's the right amount of contrast. Foreground and background. Accessibility is really important, especially when you have a lot of users, because therefore your pool gets bigger and you might have more people and more users with accessibility issues. So contrast is definitely something important to address. And this might look like in practice, like you have a design, and then when you see your coded version, like something might just be completely different. And that means there's something that got lost in translation that needs to be addressed. So as a quick little activity, this shouldn't take more than a few minutes. We have a developed version here at the top, which has this red X, and then we have the designed version down here. So if you could hop into Menti and tell me what might be the difference between these two designs here. So like I said before, just to remind you, we have fonts, interactions, placements, consistency, colors, and contrast. So there's probably more than one here that's not functioning properly, so you can vote for more than one. And also, I apologize if there's designers on the call and they disagree with me. You're allowed to disagree with me as well. So all right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as we get some answers here. There we go. Let's move this over here. So we have fonts. A lot of people say fonts. That's right, because you know some of the weighting of the fonts here is a little bit different. Interactions, yeah, we could definitely argue that the interactions aren't right because like the buttons are a little bit different color. We do see the color, so the blue button here is a little bit different, and the contrast between the original design and the develop button is different. So we could argue that there's actually a lot here. When we think about this and we look at this originally, we see like, well, it's not like a huge difference. It's just like a little font thing. But when we look at all 6 of these elements, we do see that almost every one of these, except for the placement of certain things, has been impacted. So really design does have a key role here in coming through and making sure that there is some consistency between what they've developed and designed, because they are designing with these best practices in mind. And we want to make sure that our product is usable to all of our users. Okay, I'm going to switch back sharing here really quickly, and then we're almost wrapped up. So we'll pass it over to Michael. So when we do find an issue, we just want to make sure that we're reporting it back in some type of consistent and shared manner. So this could just be following our normal bug template. However, if it's something that's super minor, typically we don't want to add a step to our process. I would advocate for design just speaking directly to our engineers and just saying, hey, there's something that's a little off. Can you go and fix this? Versus like formalizing it and putting it into a bug. However, if we're in a time crunch and like, hey, I don't have enough time to do this, can you write it down in a bug and we'll prioritize it? 100%. And if we do, then it should be in this consistent format that we follow for our bug process and our bug reporting process. So we want to just try to involve whoever's part of this ticket right away when the designers catch something. And if it's significant, then we might just say, hey, let's write it down on a bug and we'll prioritize it later. It should follow our normal bug process. So from acceptance testing in general, so we've talked about automated acceptance testing, we've talked about the PM and their role in manual acceptance testing, and then the user's involvement in user acceptance testing, or UAT. We've also talked about designers and how they can involve themselves in this design review, design QA, which is quality assurance process. Are there any questions overall about how we do this, the benefits, some of the complexities, as well as like how this whole process works from start to finish? All right, rock on. If you have questions, please use the chat. I always like this meme that I'm sure maybe I've probably shared this before because I think it's really insightful. But I like the quote that quality is not an accident, it's the outcome of thorough testing. So if we test and we have that as part of our process at every single step, then we're going to have good quality in production. So we want to make sure that like however our users explained it is how we're actually translating that into requirements, building our tests, building our code, and reviewing it down the road. So we want to make sure that quality is part of every single part of our process and that we're committing ourselves to a really high standard. So I will share this deck, but I want to leave some time for Michael to come in and do a quick demo in the Wave Cave. So what Michael's going to show is that essentially the Harm team is piloting this new process for acceptance testing. So it's how the PMs are going to write their issues and then go in and test the software against those issues or the acceptance criteria that's been listed in Linear. So he's going to demo this process and actually test some live software and then show what happens when an acceptance test passes or fails and how that gets communicated back to the team. So Anderson, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, I will pass it off to you.
All right. Perfect. Look at that. Okay. So over the past couple of weeks, Harm as a team has had several different discussions about the different ways that you can handle tickets in Linear, and using things that aren't necessarily made for certain applications, but us kind of manipulating it for what we need. And throughout that process, we've come to find that we're able to separate out tickets to have sub issues within them, which allows you to then pull them and create auto documentation. And so by like separating out like the PM acceptance test into a sub issue, you're able to pull that along with let's say the design and put it on a document automatically. So the design and the PM acceptance test are displayed together, and it's really easy to read and extremely fast to do. And it's a little bit of an interesting process at first. So when you're within Linear, you can go to your templates and you can create templates for things. And what that allows you to do is when you go and create a new ticket, it'll automatically pull up a where you can write this is where we put our user story and our title, and the template will then have the sub issues that you want to automatically fill on it. So this one, the ones that we've decided on so far, and we're still playing with it a little bit, so we might end up adding or changing some things in the future, is functional requirements, UI prototype, developer or test, and PM acceptance test. So as a PM, I would go through and write my user story, and then I would input my PM acceptance test and save my sub issue. And then that would get passed off to the designer to then put in the Figma links into the UI prototype. And then at that point, developers would have the opportunity to look at it during like pre-IPM. And once it gets moved to IPM, when you look at it on the main page, you end up seeing just the main ticket. One caveat to this is if you show the sub issues, it really jumbles your view of it in linear. But if you just turn the sub tickets off, then you can see the main tickets and be able to. Sorry, my apologies. You see the main tickets, and then you can, when you access them, then you see the sub issues within them, the main user story, and then you're able to navigate through and see the PM acceptance tests and the developer tests and all the activities and stuff like that. The ticket that we're going to run through today is a previous ticket that my team has went through, and I have moved over to this new format. So Boozer, which is one of our users, wants an exercise homepage. So as Boozer, I want an exercise homepage so that I have a place to visualize my shots and players for an exercise. And this is a process that has moved all the way through. And so the status of it has been done. It's been pointed. This is something that did fail on acceptance test. And so when that happens, we added a label towards it. And because this was done before our new way of kind of inputting tickets, the developers test and the functional requirements aren't necessarily needed because this is more updating a previous ticket. And so these are really easy to just go through and delete them because they're not needed specifically for this. There's nothing that we need to pull from that. And then that allows you to clean up your tickets at the same time. And so after it had went through the process, went through the backlog, it had been picked up by one of our developers and went through all the development process and was merged. It was put into our acceptance testing area within our linear. At that point, me as a PM, I would go in through and look at the acceptance test that I wrote prior to and read through it. Okay, kind of refresh my memory on what's going on with it. And then I'll go to the program and do as it's kind of stated out. So given I'm on the start new assessment page, mandatory fields populated. So that would be, this is starting a new assessment. We'll name it Bob, for instance, and put the exercise dates. Doesn't. It'll be the first go. And two of the portions for our program that are very pivotal is the key box data and radiation data of when certain sites are radiating and some other information. And there's two options that that are allowed on this page once the required fields. So the required fields are name of exercise and exercise date. And as the PM acceptance or the acceptance test states, okay, so when I click on the continue button, I'm taken to the exercise homepage. So then I'll go through and click the continue button, and I'm on the exercise homepage. We have a small description of what the page kind of looks like. So I have the harm and wavelength photo at the top left. I see the table of call sign, player status, shot taken, weapon shots, and pod numbers, headers, exercise name that I inputted into the program, the date of the exercise, which go, so whether it was first go for the day or second go, the data that I added within it, export files button, and it basically just laying out the page as a whole. So if we kind of go through this, okay, so there's the recent assessments and exercise homepage. Some of this stuff is for backdoor while we're debugging and going through stuff. This isn't used when going through the acceptance test. So as we're acceptance testing, we don't use any of this. But it displays the name that we put, Bob, the date, and so on and so forth. And then it also shows what portions of the page will display. So no players yet, add players to the subtext, and goes through recent assessments. And so at this point, at reading through our exact test word for word verbatim and looking at the page and going through it, okay, great, our continue button works. It's passed the test. This one specifically, when it was going through our original process, ended up failing our acceptance test. And in that, instead of it navigating, so once we created the new assessment, and clicked continue. Instead of navigating to the actual assessments exercise homepage like instructed, it threw you back in recent assessments, which then you would have to go and open that assessment. And so as we scrolled down, we commented and said, okay, this failed the acceptance test. When we click the new assessments continue button, it didn't take us to the exercise homepage and the acceptance criteria. And the number of goes did not display next to this exercise homepage. It just said go currently without context of 1 or 2 specified. So looking in the page now, because our developers have went through and fixed it, it just said go. So we took notations on that kind of thing and put it into our notes. And there was a couple other little things that didn't specifically match up to the design, the Figma design. So like the key box and radiation data buttons were swapped what was specifically on the design. So these were reversed. The navigation not aligned with the design. So up the top here. And those were things that were outliers that weren't specifically stated in our PM like acceptance tests, but things that we wanted to notate as it was not in it's not in the exact display as what the Figma and what the designer had intended for it to be. Once we kind of move through that process, we label it and say that the main ticket has failed the acceptance test. And then we'll push it back into our in progress and notify the assignee that picked up the ticket, like, hey, by the way, this failed the acceptance test. And so they're tracking on it and know to go back to it and continue on it with it. At that point, it'll get pushed back up to acceptance test and ran through again by us. And in this specific instance, at that point, it passed the acceptance test and we commented that and notified the team. And again, kind of circling back to the beginning, the main portion, the main hope with all of this is, although there's a little bit more interaction that's needed, especially with every portion of the team, this allows every portion of the team to touch the ticket before even touching IPM, allowing everybody to be familiar with it. And if anybody sees anything that they disagree with, then it can be brought up at IPM. But the ability to create auto documentation that's broken down for your entire project, we see that it could be extremely beneficial in the future. And one of the nice things about it too is, so we're naming these projects HAP 0.1 as of now. So when we go and we want to pull some and create some documentation, we can specify that we only want tickets that are from HAP 0.1. So we can pull even from version to version, or pull the entirety of our linear and create documentation for it, so that it cuts out a lot of man hours in trying to create like all the things that leadership might request in the future. And it's standardized, which makes it really nice too. So if or when other teams adopt this, when we create the documentation, every team will have extremely similar looking forms, allowing for, again, leadership to be able to then look at it across the board and have an understanding of what's going on for every team.
Awesome.
Is there any questions? No? All right.
Thanks, Anderson. Yeah, so Harm team is kind of piloting this new format for sub issues, and they're going to see kind of how it works in practice and see if it's something that maybe the other teams want to adopt. There is potentially the issue of just like, how do we address the tickets that we've already created? So, as they continue in with this process, it sounds like it's working effectively for them. I think we'll have to see if this is also effective for the other teams and what that might look like if they decide to adopt that. But I appreciate it. I really like how acceptance testing is kind of broken out, and it's really clear when something passes and fails, because a lot of times there's some communication gap when something might not pass correctly, and that doesn't get reported back, or if it does get reported back, it's not communicated effectively. So I really like how the harm team is addressing that. And with that, does anybody have questions about today's lecture workshop, what Anderson presented, what I talked about, before we close up? All right, great. I hope you guys take this and just think about how you can apply this and how we can think about quality with each individual team from A to Z. So the quality isn't just one person's job on our team, it's everybody's job. So as we move forward, just keep that in mind. If you have any more questions on testing, acceptance testing, manual, I would say if you have automated acceptance testing, you could go to Dale because he's going to follow up with this awesome AC lecture and workshop. But please don't hesitate to reach out. More than happy to answer questions or discuss further. And we will follow up with the recording and the presentation link. So thank you, everybody. Go forth and tackle the rest of your Monday.